What's going on, guys? Dominic Downs, Director of Pitching Development for the Varsity Shop Training Center. Today I want to talk about what training economy is and how we can use this information to better program our athletes to increase performance and decrease the risk of injury. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is training economy. It's essentially the total amount of spending that an athlete spends each day of his training. So I like to use the term or the example of a dollar bill when describing it. Essentially, if an athlete were to throw, that could be 40 cents, lifting could be 40 cents, and then his warm-up or throwing or anything that he's doing outside could be another 20 cents. So that would fill up his dollar bill for the day. It's important to note when we talk about training economy and we use the dollar bill that it's okay to occasionally overspend when we're doing a high intent day. If we're doing pull downs, we might overspend that dollar for the day, but it's important that we make time for recovery throughout our program. When we get into issues when we accumulate debt, so we're constantly overspending that dollar, then we can get into a situation where we're increasing the risk of injury, decreasing performance or arm fatigue, and we kind of run into the exhaustion phase. So a big thing that we can keep a note is volume. Volume is huge when talking about training economy, more or less than the total intensity that we're doing with our workouts. So the volume is key. It's also important to note that our athletes are doing things possibly outside of our program. So knowing what they're doing, if they're playing another sport such as like basketball, football, wrestling, if they're really, really stressed out in school, they're not getting a lack of sleep, nutrition, all of that can kind of play a role in the athlete's training economy and their ability to recover. So it's important to note what they're doing and being able to make those adjustments for each athlete that has stuff going on outside of school. So one thing that we can do when talking about training economy and how we can program it is really matching the volume with our lifting and our throwing. So these two have to go hand in hand to allow for proper development and not constantly overspending our dollar. So I wrote down some phases here that we typically go through at the Varsity Shop and kind of talk about the volume that each phase would have for the throwing and the lifting. So for the throwing on an on-ramp, it's going to start off low and incrementally get into a moderate intensity and volume. This is a great time for the weight room for the volume to be high, so either in a hypertrophy phase, the intensity in the weight room would be low during this period, but the volume would increase as the throwing is steadily starting low and then increasing each week that he's on-ramping, depending on how much time he took off. For a development phase, we use this for some athletes that have on-ramped but are still working out movement deficiencies. We want to still work on movement patterning for some athletes before getting into a velocity phase. Or if the athlete is young and needs to put a lot of his emphasis and training economy into the weight room, we'll put him on a development phase where the throwing will be more moderate, so we will be throwing more. The intensity would be more moderate as well, while the weight room is still a moderate volume-wise. So he'll be working, maybe a set of hypertrophy, maybe into strength, but these two will kind of go hand in hand with the development phase. For velocity, this is where the throwing will be more of a low moderate, but the intensity will be high. So we'll be doing plyo velos, pull downs, mound velos. The intensity for the throwing will be high, so our volume will end up being more lower, as well as the weight room. So the weight room intensity can be high, sets where we're going to be in either a velocity-based training phase, or if we're in high strength, we're working on increasing the amount of weight to the bar, but we're keeping the volume low. So we're not doing sets of 3 sets of 10. It's more of 3 sets of 3 to 5, keeping the volume low to match the throwing, but the intensity will be high. For a blend to mound phase, this is usually when athletes are after the velo phase. If they weren't on the mound previously, we'll use this time to blend them to the mound, get the feel of the slope back, and transition those movements that they made in the on-ramp development and velocity phase over to the mound. So for the throwing here, it'd be more moderate. We're not blowing it up. We're not doing mound velos or plyo velos off the mound. This is more mound blend A's and B's where the intensity is changing between 60 to 90% on any given day. So the throwing volume will be moderate there. The weight room, again, will be low to moderate, so we can still use this time to make great strength gains in the weight room. So the volume might be low, but the intensity would still be high, lifting heavy and developing in that. For mound development, the throwing will probably increase more. So this will be for guys that are doing pitch design on Rapsodo, guys that are developing off-speed pitches and that type of stuff. The volume will probably be higher on the throwing side, just because they're going to have more reps, working out different stuff, kind of like a trial and error process. So that could tend to lead to more of a throwing volume during that period. And in the weight room, we want to stay with low, moderate volume. Intensity still stays high. We can still make gains in the weight room. If the athlete is strong and has that baseline, that foundation, we can still work on mixing in VBT phases and strength phases into that, depending on what he needs and what he lacks. And then lastly, for competition, throwing will be high. Whether you're practicing, you are throwing bullpens, you're throwing in-game. So roughly the throwing volume will be high as well as the intensity. So it's important that we track that and be able to manage that appropriately. And then the weight room will be low. We can still maintain a high intensity in the weight room during the competition phase while we're in season. It's just important that we manage it, what days we're lifting, so the athlete is able to recover and we're able to get that type of benefit from him. We can still make gains in season. A lot of it is going to be maintenance, but we can still make gains and be able to kind of follow this model will help kind of keep the balance between the throwing and the lifting, so guys are able to recover and be able to maximize their results given what phase they're in.